"Hey, you can't loiter here like some street thug," Officer Joshua Morgan shouted, slamming his patrol car door. "This is City Hall, not your corner." He stormed toward the black man in the tailored suit, hand already moving to his cuffs. What he didn't know was that Caleb Slater wasn't loitering. He was waiting for the mayor to arrive for their 8 a.m. budget meeting, and as chief of staff, he held the keys to Joshua's entire department's funding. "Which state do you live in? Have you ever been judged before anyone knew who you really were? What would you do if this happened outside your workplace?" The morning air hung crisp and clean around Riverside City Hall, carrying the scent of fresh coffee from the nearby municipal cafe and the distant hum of early commuters navigating the downtown grid. At 7:43 a.m., the granite steps leading to the imposing government building were mostly empty, save for a few groundskeepers tending to the precisely manicured flower beds that flanked the main entrance. The American flag hung motionless in the still air, its fabric barely stirring as the first hints of sunlight painted the building's limestone facade in shades of gold and amber. Caleb Slater stood with his back straight, briefcase resting against his right leg, checking his phone for the third time in 10 minutes. The mayor's text had been clear. Early budget meeting, 8 a.m. sharp, main entrance. As chief of staff, Caleb had attended hundreds of these early morning sessions, but today felt different. Today they were discussing the police department's funding allocation for the next fiscal year, a conversation that would determine everything from patrol schedules to equipment purchases to officer salaries. At 42, Caleb carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his position through merit, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to public service. His navy blue suit was immaculate, tailored to perfection, with a crisp white shirt and burgundy tie that spoke of attention to detail and professional standards. His leather briefcase, a gift from his wife when he first accepted the chief of staff position 3 years ago, contained budget projections, departmental reports, and policy recommendations that would shape the city's law enforcement for years to come. The irony wasn't lost on him that he, a black man who had experienced his share of racial profiling throughout his life, now held significant power over the very department that had once viewed him with suspicion. From his teenage years being stopped while walking through upscale neighborhoods, to the traffic stops that lasted longer than they should have, to the subtle but persistent assumption that he didn't belong in professional spaces, Caleb had navigated a lifetime of proving his worth to people who questioned his presence before knowing his purpose. Joshua Morgan's patrol car rounded the corner of 5th and Main at exactly 7:44 a.m., the engine's rumble cutting through the morning quiet like a chainsaw through silk. At 35, Joshua had been with the Riverside Police Department for 12 years, long enough to develop what he considered an instinct for trouble, but what others might recognize as a confirmation bias wrapped in a badge. His morning had already been challenging, a domestic disturbance call that ended with paperwork, a fender bender that required traffic direction, and a sergeant who reminded him that his quarterly performance review was overdue. As Joshua guided his patrol car into the circular drive in front of City Hall, his eyes immediately locked onto the figure standing near the main entrance. A black man in expensive clothing, checking his phone, positioned where most people wouldn't be at this hour, unless they were waiting for something or someone. In Joshua's 12 years of experience, people who loitered around government buildings at dawn typically fell into one of several categories: homeless individuals seeking shelter, activists planning demonstrations, or criminals casing potential targets. The possibility that the man might belong there, might have legitimate business, might even outrank him in the city's hierarchy, never crossed Joshua's mind. His training had taught him to assess threats quickly, but his personal biases had taught him to assume guilt before innocence when certain visual cues aligned. And everything about this situation triggered those deeply embedded assumptions. Caleb noticed the patrol car immediately, but didn't think much of it. Police presence around City Hall was routine, especially during business hours when city council meetings, public hearings, and official events drew crowds. He glanced at his phone again. 7:45 a.m. The mayor would arrive in 15 minutes, probably with her usual entourage of assistants, security, and the ever-present cup of coffee that had become her trademark during early morning meetings. What Caleb didn't expect was the aggressive slam of the car door, followed by the sharp crack of leather boots against pavement as Joshua Morgan began his approach. The officer's body language was unmistakable. Shoulders squared, chest forward, hand positioned near his service weapon, eyes locked on target. This wasn't a casual check-in or a friendly greeting. This was a confrontation looking for a reason to escalate. "Hey, you can't loiter here like some street thug." Joshua's voice carried across the plaza, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is City Hall, not your corner." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Not because they were unexpected. He had heard variations of this language before, but because of the setting and timing. Here he was, literally steps away from his workplace, dressed in professional attire, carrying materials for an official meeting, and being treated like a criminal by an officer whose department budget he was about to review. Caleb's first instinct was to respond, to identify himself, to defuse the situation before it spiraled beyond control. But something deeper, something born from years of navigating systemic racism, told him to wait, to observe, to let Officer Morgan reveal exactly who he was before revealing who he, Caleb, truly was. Joshua continued his approach, each step deliberate and threatening. His hand moved to his handcuffs, the metal catching the morning light as he prepared for what he assumed would be a routine arrest of a vagrant who had somehow acquired nice clothes. In his mind, the narrative was already written: suspicious individual, possible theft of clothing, likely drug-related, definitely doesn't belong in this space. "I said you can't loiter here," Joshua repeated, his voice rising with each syllable. "This is government property, and you don't have any business being here." Caleb remained motionless, his briefcase still resting against his leg, his posture unchanged. He was calculating, not just his next move, but the broader implications of this moment. As chief of staff, he understood that his response would set a precedent. How he handled this confrontation would send a message not just to Officer Morgan, but to every city employee, every community member, and every person who might find themselves in a similar situation. The morning shift was beginning to arrive at City Hall. A few early employees emerging from the parking garage noticed the scene unfolding on the front steps. Some slowed their pace, sensing tension but not yet understanding the full scope of what they were witnessing. Others quickened their steps, uncomfortable with the obvious racial dynamics playing out in front of their workplace. Maria Gonzalez, a budget analyst in the city manager's office, paused near the side entrance as she recognized the familiar figure in the navy suit. She had worked with Caleb on dozens of budget presentations, had seen him command rooms full of department heads and elected officials, had watched him navigate complex political situations with grace and strategic thinking. Seeing him being confronted by a police officer created a cognitive dissonance that left her momentarily frozen. Should she intervene? Should she identify him? Should she call someone? Maria's hesitation reflected a broader social paralysis that occurs when people witness injustice, but feel uncertain about how to respond effectively. Her phone was in her hand, thumb hovering over the camera app, torn between documenting potential misconduct and respecting her colleagues' privacy. Joshua was now within 10 feet of Caleb, close enough to see the quality of his clothing, the expensive watch on his wrist, the professional briefcase at his side. But these details, rather than suggesting legitimacy, only reinforced Joshua's suspicions. In his worldview, a black man with expensive items was more likely a thief than a professional. "Turn around and place your hands against the wall," Joshua commanded, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I need to see some identification, and I need to know what you're doing here." Caleb finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, devoid of the anger or fear that Joshua expected to hear. "I'm waiting for a meeting." The simplicity of the response seemed to irritate Joshua further. He had anticipated defensiveness, excuses, maybe even aggression, responses that would justify escalation. Instead, he was met with a quiet dignity that didn't fit his narrative. "A meeting? Here? At City Hall?" Joshua's tone dripped with skepticism. "What kind of meeting does someone like you have at City Hall?" The phrase "someone like you" hung in the air between them, loaded with centuries of assumption and prejudice. Caleb heard it clearly, as did the growing number of city employees who were beginning to gather at a respectful distance. The words revealed everything about Officer Morgan's mindset, and nothing about Caleb's actual identity or purpose. "A budget meeting," Caleb replied, still maintaining his composed demeanor. "I'm waiting for the mayor." Joshua laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the limestone walls of City Hall. "The mayor? You're waiting for the mayor?" He turned to address the small crowd that had gathered, as if inviting them to share in his amusement. "This guy thinks he has a meeting with the mayor." What Joshua didn't notice was that several people in the crowd were nodding, their faces showing recognition rather than amusement. They knew exactly who Caleb was, exactly why he would be meeting with the mayor, and exactly how catastrophic this situation was becoming for Officer Morgan. Lisa Chen, the mayor's press secretary, had just arrived and was watching the scene unfold with growing horror. She knew that Mayor Patricia Williams would arrive in less than 10 minutes. She knew that Caleb was her most trusted advisor, and she knew that this confrontation was about to become a public relations nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Lisa's mind raced through potential responses. Call the mayor directly, contact the police chief, document everything with her phone, or intervene immediately. Each option carried risks, but inaction seemed like the worst choice of all. Meanwhile, Caleb continued to wait, his patience serving as both a strategy and a form of resistance. He understood that every additional second Officer Morgan spent making assumptions, every word of prejudice that fell from his lips, every escalation of aggression, was building a case that would ultimately reform the entire department's approach to community interactions. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the City Hall plaza and illuminating a confrontation that would be remembered long after the budget meeting that had brought them all together. In 12 minutes, Mayor Williams would arrive to find her chief of staff being harassed by one of the officers whose funding they were scheduled to discuss. In 12 minutes, Officer Joshua Morgan's career would face its defining moment. In 12 minutes, the city of Riverside would confront a truth about itself that many had preferred to ignore. But for now, in this moment, suspended between ignorance and revelation, Caleb Slater continued to wait with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he belonged and exactly who held the real power in this equation. The question wasn't whether Officer Morgan would learn the truth about the man he was confronting. The question was whether he would learn it in time to save himself. Joshua's radio crackled to life as he reached for it with his free hand, his eyes never leaving Caleb's composed figure. Unit 247, requesting backup at City Hall main entrance. Suspicious individual, refusing to comply with lawful orders. The words rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, each syllable reinforcing his conviction that he was handling a routine vagrant situation rather than confronting the second most powerful person in city government. The response came within seconds, tinged with the casual efficiency that marked the morning shift. Copy that. 247. Unit 251 en route. ETA 3 minutes. Officer Rebecca Torres was already turning her patrol car around from her position 6 blocks away, assuming she was responding to another homeless individual who had wandered into restricted areas. She had worked with Joshua for 4 years and trusted his judgment, never questioning his assessment of situations involving what the department euphemistically called quality of life issues. As the backup request echoed through police radios across Riverside, a system larger than any individual officer began to move with mechanical precision. Dispatcher Sandra Mitchell logged the incident as trespassing vagrant City Hall, automatically generating a case number that would soon become evidence in what investigators would later call the most documented case of racial profiling in the city's history. Caleb felt the weight of the moment settling around him like a familiar coat. This wasn't his first encounter with law enforcement's assumptions, but it was certainly the most public and the most professionally significant. As chief of staff, he had spent countless hours in meetings discussing police-community relations, reviewing use of force policies, and analyzing data that showed persistent disparities in how officers treated citizens based on race and socioeconomic status. Now he was becoming a data point in his own research. 3 years ago, when Mayor Patricia Williams had first offered him the position of chief of staff, Caleb had hesitated, not because he doubted his qualifications, his master's degree in public administration from Georgetown, His 8 years as a policy analyst for the state legislature and his reputation for building consensus across political divides spoke for themselves. He had hesitated because he understood the unique pressures that would come with being a black man in such a visible position of power. You'll be representing more than just yourself. His wife Angie had warned him during one of their late-night conversations about the job offer. Every decision you make, every interaction you have, every success and every mistake will be scrutinized through a lens that white men in similar positions never have to consider. She had been right, of course. From his first day in office, Caleb had felt the weight of representation, the unspoken expectation that he would serve as both a policy expert and a symbol of progress, that he would navigate racial dynamics while somehow remaining colorblind, that he would challenge systemic inequities without making anyone uncomfortable about their complicity in those systems. The mayor had been explicit about her expectations. I need someone who can see the city through multiple lenses, who understands both the policy mechanics and the human impact of our decisions. You've lived experiences that most of us can only read about in reports. Now standing on the steps of City Hall, while Officer Morgan, prepared to arrest him for the crime of waiting while black Caleb, wondered if the mayor had anticipated this particular scenario when she spoke about human impact. Joshua's hand tightened on his handcuffs as he processed Caleb's claim about meeting with the mayor. In his worldview, the suggestion was so absurd, it bordered on insulting. The mayor met with department heads, city council members, business leaders, and other officials, not with random individuals who appeared suspicious outside government buildings. Let me get this straight, Joshua said, his voice carrying a tone of exaggerated patience that teachers might use with particularly slow students. You're telling me that you, he gestured dismissively at Caleb's entire person, have a meeting with Mayor Williams at 8 in the morning about the budget? The watching crowd had grown to nearly a dozen people, most of them city employees who were beginning their workday with front row seats to what was shaping up to be either a comedy of errors or a tragedy of assumptions. Among them, David Park, the city's information technology director, was discreetly recording the interaction with his phone, his finger hovering over the live stream button as he debated whether to document this in real time. Maria Gonzalez had moved closer, no longer trying to hide her interest in the unfolding situation. As someone who worked closely with the budget office, she knew that today's 8 a.m. meeting was crucial. They were reviewing police department funding allocations that would determine everything from officer salaries to equipment purchases to community outreach programs. She also knew that Caleb had spent weeks preparing for this meeting, analyzing data, consulting with community groups, and developing recommendations that balanced public safety needs with fiscal responsibility. Watching him being treated like a criminal by an officer whose paycheck depended on the very budget decisions Caleb would help make created a surreal cognitive dissonance that left her struggling to process the scene. The sound of approaching sirens began to filter through the morning air, distant but growing closer. Officer Rebecca Torres was making good time through the light traffic, her patrol car's emergency lights flashing as she responded to what she assumed was a routine backup call. Rebecca had been with the department for 7 years and had worked enough shifts with Joshua to trust his judgment about suspicious behavior. What she didn't know was that she was about to become part of a case study that would be discussed in police academies, civil rights training seminars, and sensitivity workshops for years to come. Caleb checked his watch. 7:52 a.m., 8 minutes until the mayor's scheduled arrival. He found himself conducting a mental calculation that no chief of staff should ever have to make. Would it be better to end this confrontation immediately by revealing his identity, or to allow it to continue long enough to demonstrate the full scope of the problem he had been tasked with addressing? As a policy expert, he understood that individual incidents, no matter how egregious, rarely generated the momentum needed for systemic change, but documented patterns of behavior, especially when they involved city officials being mistreated by the very departments they oversaw, had the potential to create the kind of public pressure that forced institutional reform. As a human being, he was exhausted by the constant burden of having to prove his right to exist in spaces where his presence was questioned before his purpose was understood. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands on the wall," Joshua repeated, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This is your last warning before you're placed under arrest for trespassing and obstruction." The legal absurdity of the threat wasn't lost on Caleb. Trespassing on public property where he was scheduled for an official meeting. Obstruction for standing quietly while waiting for his employer. The charges wouldn't survive the first 5 minutes of legal scrutiny, but the damage to his reputation, the humiliation of being arrested in front of his colleagues, and the implicit message about who belonged in positions of power would linger long after any charges were dropped. Lisa Chen, the mayor's press secretary, had positioned herself near the main entrance where she could monitor the situation while maintaining phone contact with the mayor's security detail. Patricia Williams was notorious for arriving exactly on time for appointments, which meant she would round the corner in approximately 7 minutes to find her chief of staff in handcuffs. Lisa's phone buzzed with a text from the mayor. "Running 2 minutes early. See you at 7:58. The message that should have been routine suddenly felt ominous. Officer Torres's patrol car turned the corner onto Main Street, emergency lights still flashing as she approached the scene. From her perspective, she could see Joshua in what appeared to be a standard confrontation with a non-compliant individual. The presence of a crowd suggested the situation might be escalating, but nothing in the scene suggested anything beyond a routine enforcement action. As she parked her patrol car behind Joshua's vehicle, Rebecca began running through the standard protocols for backup situations: assess the threat level, support the primary officer's authority, maintain crowd control, and document any resistance or unusual behavior. What she couldn't see from her position was the growing recognition on the faces of city employees who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. Thomas Wright, the city's legal counsel, had just emerged from the parking garage when he spotted the familiar figure in the navy suit. Thomas had worked with Caleb on dozens of legal matters, had seen him negotiate complex intergovernmental agreements, had watched him present budget recommendations to hostile city council members with unflappable professionalism. Seeing him being confronted by police officers created an immediate legal alarm in Thomas's mind. He understood the potential liability issues, the civil rights implications, and the public relations disaster that was unfolding in real time. But he also understood that any intervention on his part might escalate the situation or be misinterpreted as obstruction. Instead, he did what lawyers do. He began documenting everything, taking detailed notes about time, participants, witness statements, and potential violations of both department policy and federal civil rights law. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and give us room to work," Rebecca Torres called out to Maria Gonzalez as she approached the scene. Rebecca's training had taught her to control the environment around any law enforcement action, to minimize distractions and potential complications. What her training hadn't prepared her for was a situation where the suspect being arrested was actually her supervisor's supervisor, a man whose policy decisions affected everything from her patrol routes to her overtime opportunities to her department's community relations initiatives. Joshua felt a surge of confidence as his backup arrived. Now it was 2 trained officers dealing with 1 non-compliant individual, the kind of numerical advantage that typically resolved situations quickly. The presence of witnesses was actually helpful. It would demonstrate that proper procedures were followed and that any resistance or inappropriate behavior came from the suspect, not from law enforcement. "This individual claims he has a meeting with the mayor," Joshua informed Rebecca as she approached. "He's been loitering here for approximately 10 minutes and refuses to provide identification or explain his legitimate purpose." Rebecca nodded, falling into the familiar rhythm of a backup situation. "Sir, we're going to need you to comply with Officer Morgan's instructions," she called out to Caleb. "Turn around and place your hands on the wall so we can verify your identity and purpose for being here." The word verify hung in the air with particular weight. Caleb's identity could be verified instantly by any of the dozen city employees watching. His purpose could be confirmed with a single phone call to the mayor's office, and his right to be present could be established by consulting the building's public access policies. But verification required the officers to believe that verification was necessary, to consider the possibility that their initial assessment might be incorrect. 2 patrol cars, 2 officers, One man in a suit with a briefcase, maintaining his dignity while the system he helped oversee prepared to arrest him for the crime of existing in a space where his authority was invisible. The mayor's car was now 3 blocks away, moving steadily through morning traffic toward a confrontation that would define her administration's commitment to the principles she campaigned on. In 3 minutes, Patricia Williams would round the corner to find the man she trusted most in city government, being treated like a criminal by officers whose department budget she was about to review with his expert guidance. In 3 minutes, Officer Joshua Morgan would learn that assumptions have consequences. In 3 minutes, the city of Riverside would be forced to confront the gap between its stated values and its lived reality. But for now, the system continued to move with mechanical precision, each component playing its assigned role in a scenario that was about to shatter every assumption underlying its operation. Caleb's decision to remain silent wasn't passive. It was strategic warfare conducted with the precision of a chess master who could see 10 moves ahead. As Officer Torres joined the confrontation and Joshua's confidence swelled with backup support, Caleb made a calculation that would define not just this moment, but the future of police-community relations in Riverside. He understood that his silence was becoming a mirror, reflecting back the officer's assumptions with crystalline clarity. The psychological dynamics of the moment were complex beyond what any police training manual could prepare officers to handle. Caleb's refusal to react with the anger, fear, or defensiveness that the officers expected was creating a cognitive dissonance that was slowly unraveling their confidence. They had been trained to deal with resistance through escalation, with compliance through authority, and with defiance through force, but they had never been trained to handle dignity under pressure. Every second he chose not to identify himself was another second that documented the automatic criminalization of black men in professional spaces. Every moment of composed dignity in the face of escalating aggression was evidence that would later be dissected in training rooms, courtrooms, and community forums across the nation. Caleb was conducting a masterclass in nonviolent resistance without saying a word. "Sir, this is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily," Rebecca Torres announced, her hand moving to her own handcuffs as she positioned herself at a tactical angle to Joshua. "Turn around and place your hands against the wall. Now." The word voluntarily carried bitter irony that wasn't lost on the growing crowd of city employees who were beginning to recognize the profound injustice unfolding before their eyes. Voluntary compliance under threat of arrest. Voluntary cooperation with officers who had already decided guilt before establishing facts. Voluntary surrender of dignity in exchange for avoiding physical confrontation with armed representatives of the state. Rebecca's positioning revealed her tactical training. She was creating a cross angle that would allow both officers to control Caleb if he attempted to resist or flee. But the tactics that worked effectively with actual criminals seemed absurdly excessive when applied to a man in a $3,000 suit carrying budget reports to a meeting with the mayor. Caleb's internal monologue was a complex symphony of personal experience, professional strategy, and ancestral memory that few people could truly comprehend. He thought of his grandfather, James Slater, who had been forced to step off sidewalks when white people approached in 1950s Alabama, who had endured the daily humiliation of Jim Crow laws while maintaining his dignity and raising a family with love and hope. He thought of his father, Robert Slater, who had taught him to keep his hands visible during traffic stops, to never make sudden movements around police officers, to always carry multiple forms of identification, and to understand that his survival often depended on his ability to make white people comfortable with his presence. The lessons had been painful to learn and painful to teach, but they had kept 3 generations of Slater men alive in a society that viewed their existence as inherently threatening. He thought of his son Marcus, who was now 15, and asking questions about justice that no parent should have to answer. Questions about why his father had to work twice as hard to achieve half the recognition. Questions about why excellence wasn't enough to protect him from assumptions based on his skin color. Questions about whether things would ever really change, or if each generation would simply face more sophisticated versions of the same prejudices. 3 generations of black men, each forced to navigate a system that viewed their presence as inherently suspicious, their success as inherently questionable, and their authority as inherently illegitimate. But Caleb also thought about the badge report he had reviewed just last week, a departmental analysis showing that black residents were 3 times more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested during quality-of-life enforcement actions. He thought about the community forums where residents described feeling criminalized in their own neighborhoods, where mothers talked about teaching their children to fear the very officers who were supposed to protect them. He thought about the policy recommendations gathering dust in filing cabinets, because changing procedures was easier than changing attitudes, because reforming systems was easier than confronting the racist assumptions that made those systems necessary in the first place. The distance between Joshua and Caleb had narrowed to less than 6 feet, close enough for the officer to see the quality of Caleb's Italian leather shoes, the precisely knotted silk tie, the gold watch that reflected morning sunlight with understated elegance. But these markers of professional success, rather than suggesting legitimacy, seemed to reinforce Joshua's suspicions in ways that revealed the deep pathology of his thinking. In Joshua's worldview, expensive items on a black man required explanation, either theft, drug dealing, or some other form of illegitimate acquisition. The possibility that Caleb had earned these items through education, hard work, and professional achievement existed outside the boundaries of Joshua's assumptions about black success and black authority. "You see that watch?" Joshua muttered to Rebecca, loud enough for nearby witnesses to hear, his voice carrying the tone of someone who believed he was sharing professional insights rather than revealing personal prejudices. "That's a $5,000 piece, Rolex Submariner, probably worth more than most people make in 2 months. How does someone like him afford something like that legitimately?" The question revealed everything about Joshua's mindset, while revealing nothing about Caleb's actual circumstances. Not "does this person belong here?" or "what is his legitimate business?" but "how does someone like him afford nice things?" The automatic assumption of criminality, wrapped in the language of reasonable suspicion, the immediate jump from expensive items to illegal activity, the complete inability to conceive of legitimate black success. Rebecca Torres felt a growing unease as she listened to her partner's commentary, but her training in officer solidarity prevented her from voicing the doubts that were beginning to multiply in her mind. The man they were confronting showed none of the typical signs of criminal behavior: no nervousness, no evasiveness, no attempts to flee or conceal evidence. Instead, he projected the kind of calm authority that Rebecca associated with judges, prosecutors, and senior government officials. But questioning a partner's judgment in front of civilians violated both departmental protocol and the unwritten code of police solidarity that had been drilled into her throughout her 7 years of service. Officers were expected to present a united front, to support each other's decisions publicly, even when they harbored private doubts, to maintain the appearance of institutional coherence, even when individual judgment might be questionable. Maria Gonzalez felt her phone burning in her pocket as she watched the scene unfold, every instinct screaming for her to intervene, but every professional consideration warning her about the consequences of interfering with police actions. She knew Caleb's story, the scholarship kid from Detroit who had worked his way through Georgetown, the policy analyst who had spent years building bridges between communities and government, the husband and father who had sacrificed higher-paying private sector opportunities to serve the public good. But more importantly, she knew what was in Caleb's briefcase: budget projections that would determine police department funding for the next 5 years, recommendations about officer training programs, policy proposals for community policing initiatives, data analysis about use of force patterns that Joshua and Rebecca would probably never see, but that would shape their careers regardless. The man they were preparing to arrest was literally holding their professional futures in his hands, and they were too blinded by racial assumptions to recognize the institutional authority standing directly in front of them. The irony was so profound, it bordered on the absurd. Officers attempting to arrest the person responsible for determining whether their department would receive funding for sensitivity training, bias reduction programs, and community outreach initiatives that might have prevented exactly this kind of confrontation. David Park, the IT director, had made his decision about documentation when he saw Joshua's hand move toward his weapon. His finger pressed the live stream button on his phone, instantly broadcasting the confrontation to his social media followers with the caption, "This is happening right now at Riverside City Hall. Our chief of staff being treated like a criminal by police who don't know who he is." The stream went live at 7:54 a.m., initially reaching David's modest following of 200 city employees, local activists, and tech industry contacts. But social media operates according to its own physics. Moments of authentic injustice have a gravitational pull that draws attention exponentially, especially when they involve clear documentation of institutional failure and obvious racial dynamics. Within 30 seconds, the viewer count hit 50. Within a minute, it reached 150. Comments began flooding in from people who recognized Caleb, people who didn't but could see the obvious racial dynamics, and people who understood that they were witnessing something that demanded documentation and analysis. "Is that really the chief of staff?" typed user at Riverside Resident 47, their comment appearing in real time as David's phone captured the escalating confrontation. "I can't believe this is happening at City Hall," added at Justice Watcher, their words reflecting the shock that many viewers felt at seeing such obvious racial profiling occurring at the seat of municipal government. "Those officers have no idea who they're messing with," observed at Policy Wonk 23, their comment revealing the anticipation that was building among viewers who understood the institutional dynamics at play. But the most prescient comment came from @LegalEagleRV. "This is going to cost the city millions in lawsuit settlements and policy reforms. Perfect documentation of institutional racism in action." The live stream was capturing not just individual misconduct, but systemic failure. The breakdown of training, the failure of supervision, the complete absence of the kind of community awareness that effective policing required. David's technical expertise ensured crystal clear audio and stable video that would make denial impossible and analysis definitive. Caleb remained motionless, his briefcase still resting against his leg, his posture unchanged despite the escalating aggression surrounding him. His stillness wasn't submission. It was resistance of the most powerful kind. By refusing to react with the anger or fear that the officers expected, he was forcing them to reveal the true nature of their assumptions while documenting their failure to follow basic professional procedures. Every person in that growing crowd could see the contrast. Two officers, hands on weapons, voices raised, preparing to arrest a man who had done nothing more than wait quietly in professional attire outside a government building where he worked. The visual narrative was so stark, it required no explanation, no context, no additional commentary. The silence that Caleb maintained was becoming a form of testimony, a wordless indictment of assumptions that viewed Black presence as inherently suspicious, Black success as inherently questionable, and Black authority as inherently illegitimate. His refusal to speak was speaking volumes about the burden placed on Black professionals to constantly justify their existence in spaces where white professionals were automatically assumed to belong. Lisa Chen watched the scene with growing panic as she calculated the public relations catastrophe unfolding in real time. The mayor's approval ratings, the department's community relations efforts, the city's reputation as a progressive municipality. All of it was being undermined by two officers who couldn't see past their own biases to recognize the institutional authority standing directly in front of them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mayor Williams. "1 minute out, everything ready for our meeting?" The innocuous message felt like a countdown to disaster, a timer marking the moments until the mayor would arrive to find her chief of staff being treated like a criminal by officers whose department budget they were scheduled to discuss. Lisa's training in crisis communications was screaming warnings about the political earthquake that was about to occur. Every speech the mayor had given about police reform, every policy initiative designed to address racial bias, every promise about changing the culture of law enforcement, all of it would be judged against this moment when two officers demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that reforms were supposed to address. Thomas Wright, the city attorney, had filled 3 pages of his legal pad with notes that would later become the foundation for the most comprehensive review of police procedures in Riverside's history. He was documenting not just the obvious constitutional violations, but the subtler policy failures that had created the conditions for this confrontation. the lack of de-escalation techniques being employed by either officer, the failure to consider alternative explanations for Caleb's presence despite obvious indicators of legitimacy, the automatic assumption of criminal intent based on racial profiling rather than behavioral evidence, the escalation of force without attempting to verify claims or gather additional information that could have resolved the situation peacefully. But Thomas was also calculating liability, the potential civil rights lawsuit that would certainly follow, the federal investigation that was now inevitable, the consent decree that might be imposed if patterns of discrimination were established through discovery. The city's insurance carrier would not be pleased with the exposure created by such thoroughly documented misconduct. The legal framework being constructed by the officers was absurd from every perspective Thomas could analyze. Trespassing charges against someone who worked in the building and had scheduled business there. Obstruction accusations against someone who had been cooperative and non-threatening. Resisting arrest claims against someone who hadn't been given lawful commands or legitimate reasons for detention. "Last warning," Joshua announced, his voice cracking slightly with the adrenaline of anticipated confrontation and the frustration of someone whose authority was being questioned by circumstances he couldn't control. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall, or you will be forcibly restrained and arrested for trespassing, obstruction of justice, and resisting arrest." The legal framework of the threat was absurd from multiple perspectives. Trespassing on public property where he was legally present for official business, obstruction for standing quietly while waiting for a scheduled appointment, resisting arrest before any lawful arrest had been established or justified. But the emotional framework was familiar to every black person who had ever navigated encounters with law enforcement: comply or face violence, regardless of innocence, regardless of legitimacy, regardless of constitutional protections. Caleb spoke for the second time since the confrontation began, his voice carrying the same calm professionalism that had made him effective in budget negotiations, policy debates, and crisis management situations where political careers hung in the balance. "I am waiting for a scheduled meeting with Mayor Williams at 8 a.m. to discuss the police department budget." The statement was factual, verifiable, and completely reasonable. It provided specific information that could be easily confirmed through official channels. It explained his presence, his purpose, and his legitimate business at City Hall. It was also, in Joshua's mind, completely unbelievable because it challenged every assumption he had made based solely on racial stereotypes and personal biases. The cognitive dissonance was too great for Joshua to process rationally. Rather than questioning his assumptions, he chose to question Caleb's honesty. Rather than considering that he might be wrong, he decided that Caleb must be lying. Rather than recognizing the institutional authority standing before him, he doubled down on the racial profiling that was destroying his career in real time. Caleb remained perfectly still, a black man in a white space, waiting for the moment when silence would give way to revelation, when dignity would triumph over prejudice, when the true power dynamics of the situation would finally be revealed. In 2 minutes, everything would change. In 2 minutes, Officer Joshua Morgan would learn that some assumptions carry career-ending consequences. In 2 minutes, the city of Riverside would begin the most difficult conversation in its history. But for now, Caleb Slater continued his silent resistance, understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is simply refusing to become what others assume you are. The moment of decision arrived like a thunderclap in slow motion. Joshua Morgan's patience had reached its absolute limit. His authority had been challenged by what he perceived as defiance, and his training screamed that control of the situation was slipping away with every second of Caleb's composed resistance. At 7:56 a.m., with the mayor's SUV still half a block away and the live stream audience approaching 600 viewers, Joshua made the choice that would define the rest of his career. "That's it," he declared, his voice sharp with finality. "You're under arrest for trespassing, obstruction of justice, and resisting lawful commands." The handcuffs emerged from his belt with a metallic click that seemed to echo off the limestone walls of City Hall like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict. The sound of metal against metal carried a weight that transcended its physical properties. For Joshua, It represented the restoration of order, the assertion of authority, the completion of a procedure he had executed hundreds of times throughout his 12-year career. For Caleb, it represented the crystallization of everything wrong with a system that criminalized black excellence, that assumed guilt before establishing facts, that transformed professional competence into suspicious behavior. The crowd of city employees collectively held its breath. Maria Gonzalez's hand flew to her mouth in shock, her budget report scattered at her feet as she struggled to process what she was witnessing. David Park adjusted his phone angle to ensure the arrest would be captured in crystal clear detail, his IT training kicking in as he optimized camera settings for maximum documentation quality. Thomas Wright's pen moved frantically across his legal pad, documenting what would likely become the most expensive 30 seconds in Riverside's municipal history. The psychological dynamics of the moment were staggering in their complexity. Joshua was operating from a worldview where his badge granted him ultimate authority to determine who belonged in public spaces and who didn't. His 12 years of experience had reinforced a pattern of assumptions that went largely unchallenged until now. In his mind, expensive clothing on a black man suggested criminal activity, professional credentials were likely fraudulent, and claims of governmental authority were elaborate deceptions designed to avoid arrest. Rebecca Torres found herself caught in a web of competing loyalties and growing unease. Her partnership with Joshua had been built on mutual trust and shared experiences, but something about this confrontation felt fundamentally different from their usual enforcement actions. The suspect showed none of the typical signs of criminal behavior, no nervousness, no evasiveness, no attempts to flee or fight. Instead, he projected the kind of institutional authority that Rebecca associated with judges, prosecutors, and senior officials. But questioning a partner's judgment in front of civilians violated both department protocol and the unwritten code of police solidarity. Officers were expected to present a united front, to support each other's decisions, to maintain the appearance of institutional coherence even when personal doubts arose. The pressure to conform, to follow the lead officer's assessment, was enormous. It was Lisa Chen who broke first. The press secretary, who had spent 3 years crafting the mayor's image as a reformist leader, who had written speeches about justice and equality, who had fielded countless media inquiries about the city's commitment to civil rights. She couldn't remain silent while watching the administration's chief of staff being handcuffed like a common criminal. "Officer, wait," Lisa called out, stepping forward from her position near the main entrance. "There's been a misunderstanding. That man is—" "Ma'am, step back immediately, or you'll be arrested for interfering with a police investigation," Rebecca Torres commanded, her own authority kicking in as she recognized the potential for the situation to spiral beyond their control. The presence of vocal witnesses was transforming what should have been a routine arrest into something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. Rebecca's intervention silenced Lisa, but it couldn't silence the growing murmur of recognition from the crowd. Whispered conversations began to ripple through the gathering like underground tremors before an earthquake. "That's definitely the chief of staff. Those officers have no idea who they're arresting. This is going to be a disaster. Someone needs to call the police chief. Where's the mayor? I've worked with him for 3 years. That's absolutely Caleb Slater. He runs the budget meetings I attend every month. Those handcuffs are about to cost the city millions." The whispers created a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding drama, a Greek chorus of municipal employees who understood exactly what was happening but felt powerless to intervene effectively. They were witnessing the collision of 2 different realities, the officer's assumption-based enforcement and the administrative reality of city government hierarchy. Joshua advanced on Caleb with the mechanical precision of someone following training protocols while ignoring the contextual warnings that should have triggered caution. His tunnel vision, a common phenomenon in high-stress law enforcement situations, filtered out everything except the immediate objective, gaining physical control of a suspect who had challenged his authority. The psychology of tunnel vision in police work had been studied extensively by researchers trying to understand how experienced officers could make catastrophic errors in judgment. Under stress, the human brain's processing capacity narrows, focusing intensely on perceived threats while filtering out contradictory information. Joshua's mental state had reduced the complex social and political dynamics of the situation to a simple binary: compliance or arrest. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Joshua ordered, his voice carrying the tone of absolute command that officers learn to project when asserting dominance. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent, though you've already chosen to ignore lawful commands." The Miranda warning, delivered with sarcastic emphasis, revealed Joshua's complete misunderstanding of the situation. Miranda rights are designed to protect suspects from self-incrimination during interrogation. But in this case, they were being weaponized as additional humiliation for someone whose only crime was standing while black. For the first time since the confrontation began, Caleb moved, not to comply, not to resist, but to make a calculated decision that would transform this moment from a personal humiliation into a public education. He slowly reached into his suit jacket's inner pocket, his movements deliberate and visible to ensure no officer could claim he was reaching for a weapon. Caleb's movement strategy reflected years of experience navigating law enforcement encounters as a black man in America. Every gesture had to be telegraphed, every intention had to be obvious, every action had to anticipate the worst possible interpretation. The simple act of reaching for identification, routine for white professionals, became a potential life or death decision for black men who understood that officer fear could escalate to deadly force in seconds. "I need to show you something," Caleb said, his voice maintaining the same professional calm that had carried him through hostile budget hearings and contentious policy negotiations. His tone was deliberate, not deferential enough to suggest guilt, not assertive enough to trigger defensive responses, but authoritative enough to command attention. Joshua's hand immediately moved to his service weapon. "Keep your hands visible. Do not reach for anything." The situation was escalating exactly as his training predicted. A suspect becoming non-compliant, making suspicious movements, potentially armed and dangerous. The irony of the moment was profound. An officer drawing his weapon in preparation to shoot the man who helped determine his department's equipment budget, his training allocations, his salary increases. The system was literally threatening to destroy itself through its own biases and assumptions. Rebecca Torres felt a surge of adrenaline as she recognized the potential for deadly force. Her own hand moved toward her weapon as department protocols kicked in. If her partner perceived a lethal threat, she was obligated to provide backup support. The situation had moved beyond simple arrest procedures into territory where lives could be lost based on misunderstandings and racial assumptions. But Caleb's movement wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was purposeful, deliberate, the motion of someone accustomed to reaching for credentials, for identification, for documents that established authority rather than challenged it. His fingers closed around a leather wallet that contained not just his driver's license, but his city identification badge, his security clearance card, and a business card that read Caleb Slater, Chief of Staff, Office of the Mayor. The wallet itself told a story that officers trained to observe details should have recognized. The leather was high quality but conservative, the kind carried by professionals who needed to present credentials regularly: judges, attorneys, senior government officials. It bore the subtle wear patterns of daily use in professional settings, not the pristine newness of recently acquired fake identification. The live stream chat was exploding with comments as viewers realized they were about to witness either a revelation or a tragedy. "He's reaching for ID. Don't shoot him. This is about to get real." Officers, about to learn who they're messing with. Someone record this moment. "I can't believe this is happening in 2025. This man is literally their boss's boss. Career-ending moment incoming. Where are the police supervisors?" This is going viral worldwide. The digital audience had grown to nearly 1,000 viewers as social media algorithms recognized the engagement patterns associated with viral content. David Park's live stream was being shared across platforms, generating additional streams, video downloads, and real-time commentary from civil rights advocates, law enforcement critics, and ordinary citizens shocked by what they were witnessing. Rebecca Torres found herself caught between competing instincts. Her training said to support her partner's authority and treat any suspicious movement as a potential threat. But her experience said that something fundamental was wrong with this entire situation. The suspect's behavior, the crowd's reaction, the setting itself, none of it fit the pattern of a typical vagrant or trespassing arrest. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Rebecca's gut instincts, developed through 7 years of street patrol, were screaming that this arrest was a mistake. But her professional training and loyalty to her partner demanded that she maintain unity and support Joshua's decisions regardless of personal doubts. Mayor Patricia Williams's SUV was now less than a block away, close enough for her to see the handcuffs glinting in Joshua's grip, close enough to recognize the stance of her chief of staff, maintaining his dignity even as 2 armed officers prepared to physically restrain him. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was arriving for a meeting about police department funding to find those same officers arresting the man who would help determine their budget. Through the SUV's tinted windows, Patricia could see the crowd of her own employees watching in shocked silence as their colleague, a man who had earned their respect through competence, integrity, and tireless public service, was treated like a criminal by officers who served at the pleasure of the government he helped run. The political calculus was staggering. Patricia had campaigned on police reform, community relations, and racial justice. She had appointed Caleb specifically because of his ability to bridge divides and build consensus. She had trusted him with sensitive policy decisions precisely because of his judgment, his professionalism, and his understanding of complex social dynamics. Now she was about to witness him being arrested by officers whose department she was supposed to reform, whose training she was supposed to improve, whose community relations she was supposed to repair. The visual metaphor was devastating. Her administration's commitment to racial justice being handcuffed by the very system she had promised to change. "Frank, get closer," she instructed her driver. "I need to intervene before this gets worse." Frank Martinez, with his 20 years of law enforcement experience, understood immediately what was happening. "Ma'am, those officers are about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. That's definitely your chief of staff, and they're treating him like a street criminal." The driver's assessment carried the weight of professional expertise. Frank had witnessed countless police encounters during his career, had seen good arrests and bad ones, had observed the subtle signs that distinguished legitimate enforcement from racial profiling. This situation had all the hallmarks of a textbook civil rights violation unfolding in real time. Caleb's wallet emerged from his jacket in slow motion, each second stretching like an eternity for everyone watching. The leather case was expensive, but understated, the kind carried by professionals who needed to present credentials regularly: judges, attorneys, senior government officials. "This is my identification," Caleb announced clearly, his voice carrying across the plaza, with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and believed. "I am Caleb Slater, Chief of Staff to Mayor Williams. I am here for a scheduled 8 a.m. budget meeting to review police department funding allocations." The words hung in the morning air like a verbal bomb, with a timer counting down to detonation. Everyone heard them clearly. Everyone understood their implications. Everyone recognized that the next few seconds would determine whether this became a moment of education or a moment of institutional catastrophe. Joshua's response revealed everything about his mindset, his training, and his assumptions. Anyone can claim to be anyone. I can get fake ID made downtown for $50. You think I was born yesterday? The rejection of Caleb's identification, without examining it, without verifying it, without even looking at it, demonstrated the complete breakdown of professional judgment. Joshua had moved beyond law enforcement into pure prejudice, beyond procedure into personal bias, beyond reasonable suspicion into willful ignorance. His dismissal of the credentials reflected a deeper pathology within policing culture, the assumption that black claims of authority were inherently fraudulent, that professional achievement by minorities was inherently suspicious, that expensive items or prestigious positions were more likely stolen than earned. Rebecca Torres finally looked at the wallet in Caleb's hand, really looked at it. The city seal was clearly visible on the official identification badge. The lamination was professional quality. The photograph matched the man standing before them. The title was printed in clear official typeface: Chief of Staff, Office of the Mayor. For the first time since arriving on scene, Rebecca felt genuine alarm, not about suspect behavior or officer safety, but about the magnitude of the mistake they were making in full view of dozens of witnesses and at least one camera phone. "Josh," she said quietly, using his first name rather than his rank, "maybe we should take a look at his ID before we—" "He's had plenty of time to produce legitimate identification," Joshua interrupted, his voice rising with the frustration of someone whose authority was being questioned by multiple sources. "All I see is someone who thinks expensive clothes and fake credentials will get him out of trouble." The interruption revealed Joshua's complete unwillingness to consider alternative explanations for what he was witnessing. His mind had locked on to the initial assessment: suspicious black male, probably criminal, and no amount of contradictory evidence could penetrate that cognitive bias. This psychological phenomenon, known as confirmation bias, had been extensively documented in law enforcement contexts. Officers who made initial judgments based on racial stereotypes often interpreted subsequent evidence through the lens of those preconceptions, seeing proof of criminality even in behaviors that clearly suggested legitimacy. Mayor Patricia Williams's SUV pulled into the circular drive directly in front of City Hall, its windows reflecting the morning sun as it came to a stop less than 50 feet from the confrontation. The official vehicle's arrival created an instant stillness, as if someone had pressed pause on a video recording. The moment of revelation was seconds away. The moment when assumptions would collide with reality. The moment when Officer Joshua Morgan would learn that some mistakes echo through careers, communities, and courtrooms for years to come. The moment when Caleb Slater's silent resistance would transform from personal dignity into institutional change. The moment when the city of Riverside would confront the gap between its progressive rhetoric and its racist reality. Patricia Williams emerged from the SUV with the controlled urgency of someone who had just witnessed the impossible, walking toward a confrontation that would test every principle she had ever claimed to believe in. The breaking point had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. "Officer Morgan." Mayor Patricia Williams' voice cut through the morning air with the authority of someone who had spent 4 years commanding city council meetings, budget hearings, and crisis management sessions. The sound of her voice, sharp, unmistakable, carrying the weight of executive power, created an instantaneous shift in the dynamics of the entire confrontation. The effect was immediate and profound. Joshua Morgan's hand froze inches from Caleb's arm, his body language shifting from aggressive confidence to sudden uncertainty as he registered the voice of his ultimate supervisor. Rebecca Torres immediately straightened, her police training recognizing the presence of high-ranking civilian authority even before her mind processed who was speaking. The handcuffs in Joshua's grip suddenly felt like evidence of his own impending professional destruction. The crowd of city employees turned as one toward their mayor, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief, anticipation, and dread. They were about to witness either the salvation of their colleague or the most politically explosive confrontation in Riverside's recent history. Maria Gonzalez felt her knees weaken with relief, while David Park adjusted his phone to ensure the mayor's intervention was captured in crystal-clear detail. Patricia Williams approached the scene with the measured pace of someone who understood that every step, every word, every gesture would be scrutinized, recorded, and analyzed for years to come. Her 4-inch heels clicked against the pavement with metronomic precision, each footfall marking the countdown to a moment that would define her administration's commitment to the principles she had campaigned on. At 51, Patricia had built her political career on the promise of reforming Riverside's approach to governance, particularly the relationship between city administration and law enforcement. She had been elected on a platform that explicitly addressed racial disparities in policing, criminal justice reform, and community accountability. Her appointment of Caleb Slater as chief of staff had been a deliberate signal to the community that her administration would be different, more inclusive, more responsive, more committed to substantive change rather than cosmetic reform. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plaza as she walked, her navy blue suit immaculate despite the early hour, her expression controlled but unmistakably angry. Patricia had attended countless police community forums during her campaign, had listened to dozens of residents describe encounters exactly like the one unfolding before her eyes. She had promised systemic change, comprehensive reform, and accountability measures that would prevent exactly this kind of incident. Now she was walking toward a scene that would test every aspect of that commitment in the most public way possible. Mayor Williams. Joshua's voice cracked slightly as he processed the implications of her presence. In 12 years of law enforcement, he had interacted with mayors only during formal ceremonies, community events, and the occasional traffic stop that required special handling. The idea that she would personally intervene in what he still believed was a routine arrest created a cognitive dissonance that left him momentarily speechless. His mind scrambled to reframe the situation in terms that would justify his actions. Maybe the mayor didn't understand what was happening. Maybe she had been misinformed about the circumstances. Maybe she would support proper law enforcement procedures once the situation was explained correctly. The alternative that he had just attempted to arrest one of the most powerful people in city government was too catastrophic to accept. Patricia's eyes locked onto Caleb's face, reading the controlled dignity that she had witnessed in countless meetings where he had navigated hostile questioning, budget challenges, and political pressure with unshakable professionalism. She could see the exhaustion behind his composed expression, not physical tiredness, but the bone-deep weariness that comes from a lifetime of having to prove your right to exist in spaces where your presence is questioned before your qualifications are considered. The mayor had worked closely with Caleb for 3 years, had seen him manage crisis communications during the downtown flooding, had watched him negotiate complex union agreements that other administrators couldn't resolve, had relied on his judgment in situations where political careers hung in the balance. She knew his character, his competence, and his commitment to public service in ways that transcended professional relationships. Seeing him being treated like a criminal by officers who served under her administration created a rage that she had to carefully control for political and legal reasons. Every instinct screamed for her to immediately fire both officers, to demand their arrest for civil rights violations, to use every power of her office to ensure justice was served. But Patricia was also a seasoned politician who understood that improper responses could undermine legitimate accountability measures. "Mr. Slater," she said, her voice carrying the warmth reserved for trusted advisors and close colleagues, "I believe we have an 8 a.m. meeting to discuss police department budget allocations." The simple statement detonated like a nuclear bomb in the silence that had settled over City Hall Plaza. 5 words, "Mr. Slater," confirmed his identity with absolute authority. The phrase "police department budget allocations" revealed the extraordinary irony of officers attempting to arrest the man who held significant influence over their professional futures. The implications rippled through the crowd like shockwaves from an earthquake. Thomas Wright, the city attorney, immediately understood that they were witnessing the most documented case of institutional racism in Riverside's history. Lisa Chen, the press secretary, realized that every police reform promise the mayor had ever made would now be judged against this moment. The city employees who had worked with Caleb felt vindicated, but also horrified that their colleague had been subjected to such treatment. Joshua Morgan's face underwent a transformation that would be analyzed frame by frame in the viral videos that followed. Color drained from his cheeks as understanding dawned. His mouth opened slightly in shock, and his eyes widened with the realization that he had just attempted to arrest one of the most powerful people in city government. The process of recognition was painful to witness. First came denial. This couldn't be the real chief of staff. Then came rationalization. There must be some explanation that justified his actions. Then came the crushing weight of reality. He had racially profiled and attempted to arrest his supervisor's most trusted advisor based purely on skin color and assumptions. The handcuffs in his grip suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The metal that had represented authority and control just moments before now felt like evidence of his own professional destruction. Every departmental policy about community relations, every sensitivity training session he had attended, every lecture about proper police procedures, all of it had been ignored in favor of racist assumptions that were now exposed for the entire city to see. Rebecca Torres experienced her own moment of horrified clarity. The man they had been preparing to arrest wasn't just any city official. He was the chief of staff, the person who worked directly with the mayor on policy decisions, budget recommendations, and departmental oversight. Her mind raced through the implications: internal affairs investigation, civil rights lawsuit, federal oversight, career destruction. Rebecca's 7 years of experience had taught her to recognize the difference between legitimate law enforcement and racial profiling, but her loyalty to her partner and her training in officer solidarity had prevented her from speaking up when her instincts screamed that something was wrong. Now she was facing the consequences of choosing institutional loyalty over moral courage. The live stream audience had exploded to over 1,500 viewers as word spread across social media platforms that something unprecedented was unfolding at Riverside City Hall. Comments flooded in faster than moderators could track. The mayor just confirmed his identity. Those cops are so fired. This is the biggest police screw-up ever caught on camera. Chief of Staff controls their budget, and they tried to arrest him. Racist cops about to learn consequences. This is going to be studied in police academies forever. Career suicide in real time. Mayor looks pissed. Justice is about to be served. Someone needs to save this video before it gets deleted. This is exactly why we need police reform. Black excellence under attack. Silent dignity wins again. System being exposed in real time. David Park adjusted his phone to capture the full scope of the scene. The mayor in her navy suit approaching with controlled authority. Caleb maintaining his dignified composure despite the humiliation, and 2 police officers beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The IT director had the presence of mind to save the live stream to multiple backup locations, understanding that this footage would become evidence in investigations, lawsuits, and policy reviews that would reshape Riverside's approach to law enforcement for years to come. The technical quality of the recording was exceptional. Clear audio, stable video, multiple angles as other witnesses began filming with their own devices. This wasn't going to be a grainy, unclear documentation that could be disputed or dismissed. This was high-definition evidence of systemic racism in action, complete with official identification, witness testimony, and executive intervention. Thomas Wright, the city attorney, was already calculating the legal implications of what had just unfolded. Federal civil rights violations, violation of due process, racial profiling, unlawful detention, assault, if any physical contact had occurred. The list of potential charges against the city was staggering, his legal pad filled with notes that would later become the foundation for the most comprehensive review of police procedures in Riverside's history. But Thomas was also documenting the remarkable restraint shown by Caleb throughout the confrontation. No aggressive behavior, no verbal threats, no actions that could be construed as provocative or threatening. The chief of staff had conducted himself with such professionalism that any legal defense based on officer safety or suspect non-compliance would be laughable. The contrast between Caleb's behavior and the officer's behavior was so stark that it would make any lawsuit unwinnable for the city. Video evidence of a calm, professionally dressed government official being threatened with arrest by officers who refused to examine his credentials would be devastating in court. Maria Gonzalez felt tears of relief and anger welling up in her eyes as she watched her colleague's identity finally acknowledged. She had worked with Caleb on dozens of budget presentations, had seen him navigate complex policy discussions with grace and intelligence, had witnessed his dedication to public service despite the personal costs of working in a highly visible, politically sensitive position. Watching him being treated like a criminal by officers who didn't recognize his humanity, his authority, or his contributions to the city had been both heartbreaking and infuriating. The revelation of his identity felt like justice finally breaking through willful ignorance. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how many other black professionals had been subjected to similar treatment without the protection of high-ranking positions. Lisa Chen, the press secretary, was already composing the statement that would define the administration's response to this crisis. How do you explain that your chief of staff was nearly arrested for standing while black outside his own workplace? How do you address the systemic issues revealed by officers who couldn't conceive of a black man belonging in a position of authority? The political damage was immediate and far-reaching. Every speech the mayor had given about police reform, every policy she had implemented to address racial bias, every promise she had made about changing the culture of law enforcement, all of it would be judged against this moment when two officers demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that reforms were supposed to address. But there was also opportunity in the crisis. This incident provided unprecedented documentation of the problems the administration had been trying to address through policy changes. It offered a chance to implement the kind of comprehensive reforms that usually required years of political groundwork and community organizing. Patricia Williams stopped approximately 10 feet from the confrontation, close enough to establish her authority, but far enough to avoid accusations of interfering with police procedures. Her positioning was deliberate. She needed to de-escalate the situation while also documenting the full scope of what had occurred. The mayor's presence transformed the dynamics completely. Suddenly, Joshua and Rebecca were no longer dealing with a routine arrest that could be processed through standard procedures and forgotten. They were participants in a political crisis that would be analyzed by civil rights attorneys, federal investigators, and police reform advocates for years to come. "Officer Morgan," she said, her voice carrying the tone she used in budget meetings when department heads tried to justify questionable expenditures. "Could you please explain why you are attempting to arrest my chief of staff outside his place of employment?" The question was devastatingly simple and utterly unanswerable. How do you explain racial profiling to the mayor who hired the man you're profiling? How do you justify assuming criminality when the suspect is literally your supervisor's most trusted advisor? How do you defend actions that violated every principle of community policing and professional law enforcement? Joshua's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. His training had prepared him for hostile suspects, dangerous situations, and community criticism, but nothing had prepared him for explaining to the mayor why he had tried to arrest her chief of staff based on the assumption that black men in expensive suits were inherently suspicious. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Joshua searched for words that could somehow justify the unjustifiable. Every possible explanation revealed the racist assumptions underlying his actions. Every attempt at rationalization exposed the complete absence of legitimate law enforcement purpose. "Ma'am, he was. There were reports of suspicious activity," Joshua stammered, his voice lacking any of the authority he had projected just moments earlier. "We were responding to concerns about someone who didn't appear to belong." "Didn't appear to belong," Patricia repeated, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "Didn't appear to belong where, exactly? Outside City Hall? In professional attire? Carrying a briefcase? Waiting for a scheduled meeting?" Each question hit like a physical blow, exposing the racist assumptions underlying the entire confrontation. The mayor was systematically dismantling the justification for the arrest, revealing the absence of any legitimate law enforcement purpose. Her prosecutorial background was evident in the precision of her questioning, the way she forced the officers to confront the logical contradictions in their position. Rebecca Torres attempted to provide support for her partner. "Ma'am, we received reports of suspicious behavior and were conducting a routine investigation when the individual became non-compliant with lawful orders." "Reports from whom?" Patricia's follow-up was immediate and devastating. Who reported suspicious behavior? What specifically was reported as suspicious? Standing while black, wearing professional attire, waiting for a meeting. Rebecca realized she had made a crucial error. There had been no reports of suspicious behavior. Joshua had simply seen a black man and assumed criminality. The lie she had told to support her partner was now exposed, adding dishonesty to the growing list of professional violations. Non-compliant. How? Patricia continued her cross-examination. Did he run? Did he fight? Did he threaten anyone? Or did he simply refuse to accept your assumption that he didn't belong here? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, because everyone present knew the truth. Caleb's only crime had been standing while black in a space where two officers couldn't imagine him belonging. Caleb finally spoke, his voice carrying the same professional tone he used in policy discussions. "Mayor Williams, I believe this situation demonstrates exactly the issues we were planning to discuss in this morning's budget meeting. The understatement was both elegant and devastating. The man who had been tasked with reviewing police department funding, training programs, and community relations initiatives had just experienced firsthand the problems his analysis had identified in departmental reports and community complaints. The irony was so profound, it bordered on the absurd. Officers had attempted to arrest the person responsible for determining whether their department would receive funding for sensitivity training, bias reduction programs, and community outreach initiatives. Patricia nodded slowly, her political mind already processing the broader implications. Indeed, Mr. Slater, I believe we have a great deal to discuss about departmental training, community relations, and accountability measures. The formal tone of her response carried an implicit threat that resonated with everyone present. This incident wouldn't be quietly buried or explained away. It would become a catalyst for the kind of systemic reform that the mayor had been attempting to implement through policy changes and budget allocations. The livestream audience had grown to over 2,000 viewers as the video was shared across multiple platforms. Social media algorithms designed to promote engagement were amplifying the content because it generated the kind of emotional response that kept people watching, commenting, and sharing. The revelation was complete. The power dynamics had been reversed. The assumptions had been shattered. Now came the question of what would happen next. Whether this moment of truth would generate lasting change, or simply become another viral video that sparked temporary outrage before being forgotten. Patricia Williams looked directly at Caleb, her expression conveying both personal support and professional solidarity. Mr. Slater, would you prefer to file a formal complaint about this incident before we proceed with our scheduled meeting, or would you like to address these issues as part of our budget discussion? The question would determine whether this moment became about personal vindication or institutional change, whether it focused on punishing individual officers or transforming departmental culture. The answer would determine whether Caleb Slater's silent resistance had achieved something greater than personal dignity, the transformation of a system that had criminalized his presence while he worked to improve it from within. Caleb's response carried the weight of 3 years serving as the bridge between community demands for justice and institutional resistance to change. Mayor Williams, I believe this incident should be addressed through the comprehensive review process we've been developing, rather than as an isolated personnel matter. This is exactly why we need systemic reform. His decision to frame the confrontation as evidence of broader institutional problems, rather than simply seeking individual justice, would prove to be strategically brilliant. It transformed a personal humiliation into a teachable moment, an individual incident into a catalyst for department-wide transformation. The political sophistication of his response demonstrated why Patricia Williams had chosen him as her most trusted advisor, his ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to long-term institutional change. Patricia Williams nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose political instincts had been validated by her most trusted advisor. Officer Morgan, Officer Torres, you are both immediately suspended pending a full internal affairs investigation. Please surrender your weapons and badges to your supervisor within the hour. The words fell like hammer blows in the morning air, each syllable carrying the weight of career destruction and institutional accountability. The mayor's voice remained steady, professional, devoid of personal anger, despite the obvious outrage she felt at seeing her chief of staff subjected to racial profiling by officers who served under her administration. Joshua Morgan's face went ashen as he processed the immediate destruction of his 12-year career. The pension he had been building, the respect he had earned in his community, the identity he had constructed around his badge and uniform, all of it was crumbling in real time. His mouth moved silently as he struggled to comprehend how a routine morning patrol had transformed into the end of everything he had worked to achieve. The psychological impact was devastating. Joshua had never seriously considered that his assumptions about black men could be wrong, that his instincts about who belonged in professional spaces could be based on racial bias rather than legitimate law enforcement experience. The cognitive dissonance of realizing he had attempted to arrest one of the most powerful people in city government was shattering his entire worldview. Rebecca Torres felt her knees weaken as she realized that her decision to support her partner's racial profiling had cost her everything she had worked to achieve in 7 years of law enforcement. The police academy training, the community college criminal justice degree she had earned while working full-time, the respect she had built with supervisors and colleagues, all of it was evaporating because she had chosen loyalty to her partner over moral courage. Rebecca's internal monologue was a tornado of regret and recognition. She had known something was wrong with the confrontation from the beginning, had seen the quality of Caleb's clothing and professional demeanor, had noticed the recognition in the eyes of city employees, but her training in officer solidarity had prevented her from speaking up when her conscience screamed that they were making a catastrophic mistake. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Joshua attempted one final defense, his voice cracking with desperation. "We were following standard procedures for suspicious behavior investigations. We couldn't have known." "Standard procedures?" Patricia's interruption was sharp as a blade. "Your standard procedures include refusing to examine official city identification? Your standard procedures include assuming that black men in professional attire are criminals? Your standard procedures include preparing to arrest someone without determining their identity or purpose?" Each question struck with prosecutorial precision, systematically dismantling every possible justification for their actions. The mayor's legal background was evident in her ability to expose the logical fallacies and procedural violations that had characterized the entire confrontation. She was building a case in real time, not just for disciplinary action, but for the comprehensive policy reforms that would prevent similar incidents. The crowd of city employees watched in fascination as their mayor methodically destroyed the officers' attempts at justification. Many of them had attended community forums where residents described similar encounters with law enforcement, had heard complaints about racial profiling that were often dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Now they were witnessing the documented reality of institutional racism in action. Lisa Chen stepped forward with her phone already pressed to her ear, speaking in rapid, clipped sentences to someone on the other end. "Chief Morrison, this is Lisa Chen from the mayor's office. We need you at City Hall immediately. 2 of your officers just attempted to arrest the chief of staff based on racial profiling. Yes, you heard correctly. Yes, it's all been recorded. Yes, this is a full-scale crisis." The press secretary's efficiency in mobilizing the crisis response team demonstrated the administration's preparation for exactly this kind of incident. For 3 years, they had been implementing policies designed to address police misconduct, but they had also been preparing for the inevitable moment when those policies would be tested by real-world events. Lisa's training in crisis communications was evident in her systematic approach to damage control. She was simultaneously notifying key stakeholders, coordinating media responses, and ensuring that the administration's narrative about police reform was properly framed from the beginning. The speed and efficiency of her response would prove crucial in determining whether this incident became a political disaster or a catalyst for positive change. David Park's live stream had reached 3,000 viewers as news organizations began picking up the story. The IT director watched his phone screen fill with notifications as the video was shared across platforms, generating additional streams, news reports, and social media commentary. What had started as a local incident was rapidly becoming national news. The viral nature of the content was driven by multiple factors that social media algorithms were designed to amplify. Clear racial dynamics that generated emotional responses, obvious institutional failure that validated existing criticisms of police departments, and perfect documentation that made the incident undeniable and shareable. Comments from verified accounts began appearing in the stream. At Civil Rights Lawyer, this is textbook racial profiling with perfect documentation. At Police Reform Now, exactly why we need federal oversight of local departments. At News Channel 7, our reporters are en route to City Hall for live coverage. At Legal Analyst, those officers just created a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. At Community Advocate, this happens every day, just usually without cameras. At Former Cop, I've seen this mentality destroy careers and communities, training failures at every level. At Law Professor, this will be studied in constitutional law classes for decades. At Mayor of Detroit, solidarity with at Riverside Mayor in addressing systemic police bias. Traduon Civil Rights. We are aware of the incident and monitoring the situation. The involvement of verified accounts from legal experts, civil rights organizations, and government officials signaled that this incident had transcended local news to become a national case study in police accountability and institutional racism. Thomas Wright was documenting everything with the meticulous attention to detail that would be crucial in the federal investigation he knew was coming. The city attorney understood that this incident would trigger Department of Justice oversight, federal consent decrees, and comprehensive reviews of every police practice in Riverside. His legal pad filled with observations that would later become evidence. The officers' refusal to examine credentials, their assumption of criminality based on race, their escalation of force without proper justification, their dishonest claims about receiving reports of suspicious behavior, their complete failure to follow de-escalation protocols. But Thomas was also calculating the broader institutional implications. This incident would cost the city millions in lawsuit settlements, federal oversight, and mandatory reforms. The police department's budget, ironically the subject of Caleb's original meeting, would be transformed from a routine allocation discussion into a comprehensive restructuring negotiation. The legal liability was staggering. Federal civil rights violations carried both criminal and civil penalties. The city's insurance carriers would demand immediate policy changes to minimize future exposure. The Department of Justice would likely impose a consent decree requiring federal oversight of police operations for years to come. Maria Gonzalez approached the scene with careful steps, her budget reports clutched against her chest like armor. She had worked with Caleb on the very police funding analysis that was supposed to be discussed in this morning's meeting, had seen his detailed recommendations for community policing programs, bias training initiatives, and accountability measures. "Mr. Slater," she said quietly, her voice carrying 3 years of professional respect and personal admiration, "the budget projections you requested are ready for review. I have the community policing allocation data you wanted to present to the mayor." Her statement served multiple purposes. It confirmed Caleb's legitimate business at City Hall. It demonstrated his active involvement in police reform efforts, and it highlighted the extraordinary irony of the situation. The man who had been racially profiled was literally the person responsible for improving police-community relations. Maria's intervention also provided crucial context for the livestream audience and gathering media. This wasn't just a random encounter between police and a citizen. It was the attempted arrest of the very official responsible for police oversight and reform. The irony was so profound, it bordered on the surreal. Chief of Police Daniel Morrison arrived at City Hall with the grim expression of someone who understood that his department was facing its worst crisis in decades. At 58, Morrison had spent 35 years in law enforcement, had survived multiple police reform initiatives, had navigated countless community relations challenges, had implemented sensitivity training programs and bias reduction protocols. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for explaining why 2 of his officers had attempted to arrest the city's chief of staff based purely on racial assumptions. The political damage was immediate and irreversible. The legal liability was staggering. The community trust that had taken years to build was shattered in a single morning. Morrison's arrival was captured by multiple cameras as news crews began assembling outside City Hall. The chief's body language, shoulders slumped, expression grim, pace deliberate, told the story of institutional failure better than any official statement could. He was walking toward his own professional reckoning, understanding that his leadership would be judged by how he handled the worst crisis in departmental history. Morrison approached the scene with the deliberate pace of someone walking toward his own professional execution. He could see the mayor's anger, the chief of staff's composed dignity, and the crowd of city employees who were witnessing the complete breakdown of police professionalism. "Mayor Williams," Morrison said, his voice heavy with the weight of institutional failure, "I've been briefed on the situation. Officers Morgan and Torres are immediately suspended pending full investigation. I'm implementing emergency protocols for community notification and federal reporting requirements." The chief's immediate acknowledgement of the severity reflected years of preparation for exactly this scenario. Police departments across the country had been forced to develop crisis response procedures for viral incidents of misconduct, and Morrison understood that rapid, comprehensive action was the only hope for institutional survival. His statement was carefully crafted to demonstrate accountability while preserving some possibility of institutional recovery. The immediate suspension showed decisiveness. The mention of federal reporting requirements demonstrated compliance with oversight obligations. The emergency protocols indicated systematic response rather than reactive damage control. Patricia Williams nodded with grim satisfaction. "Chief Morrison, this incident will serve as the foundation for the comprehensive police reform initiative that Mr. Slater and I have been developing. Every policy, every training program, every community relation protocol will be reviewed through the lens of what happened here this morning." The mayor's statement transformed the incident from a crisis to be managed into an opportunity for the kind of fundamental change that usually required years of political organizing and community pressure. The documentation was perfect, the witnesses were credible, and the institutional failure was undeniable. Patricia's political experience was evident in her ability to reframe disaster as opportunity. Rather than simply responding to crisis, she was positioning the incident as validation of reform efforts the administration had been pursuing for years. The confrontation provided the evidence base for policy changes that had previously faced resistance from police unions and conservative council members. Caleb finally moved from his position near the City Hall entrance, his briefcase still in hand, his dignity intact, despite the humiliation he had endured. "Chief Morrison, I want to be clear that this incident represents exactly the kind of systemic thinking that our reform proposals are designed to address. This isn't about individual officers. This is about institutional culture." His statement demonstrated the political sophistication that had made him effective as chief of staff. Rather than seeking personal vengeance, he was positioning the incident as evidence supporting policy changes that the administration had been advocating for years. The strategic thinking was remarkable, transforming personal attack into institutional opportunity. Caleb's response also provided crucial guidance for the media narrative that was already forming. By framing the incident as systemic rather than individual failure, he was directing attention toward policy solutions rather than personal punishment. The approach would prove crucial in building community support for comprehensive reform rather than simple officer termination. The crowd of city employees began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly, as if they understood they had witnessed something historically significant. Many were already pulling out their phones to call colleagues, to share what they had seen, to ensure that the story would spread beyond the immediate witnesses. The employees were processing their own complicity in a system that had allowed such thinking to flourish unchecked. They had worked alongside these officers at community events, had processed their paperwork, had shared coffee in break rooms. The realization that their colleagues were capable of such obvious racial bias was forcing uncomfortable self-examination about institutional culture. Rebecca Torres stood in shocked silence, her hand moving unconsciously to her badge as she processed the reality of her suspension. 7 years of career advancement, community respect, and professional identity were evaporating in real time. Her decision to support her partner's racial profiling had destroyed everything she had worked to achieve. The psychological impact on Rebecca was particularly devastating because she had genuinely believed she was a good officer, someone who served her community with integrity and professionalism. The realization that she had participated in textbook racial profiling challenged everything she thought she knew about herself and her profession. Joshua Morgan was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. 12 years of law enforcement experience, a pension that was now in jeopardy, a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his career, all of it sacrificed because he couldn't conceive of a black man belonging in a position of authority. The institutional reckoning had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. Within 2 hours of David Park's live stream ending, the incident at Riverside City Hall had become the most watched police accountability video of the year. The footage had been downloaded, edited, and reshared across every major social media platform. generating millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, and a tsunami of public discourse about racial profiling in law enforcement that reached far beyond anything the participants could have imagined. David Park sat in his City Hall office, staring at his phone screen in disbelief as the view counter climbed past 500,000, then 750,000, then broke through 1 million views within 3 hours of the incident. His modest Twitter following of 200 municipal employees and tech industry contacts had exploded to over 50,000 followers as news organizations, civil rights groups, and ordinary citizens shared his documentation of what many were calling the most clear-cut case of institutional racism caught on camera. "Sarah, you need to see this," David told his wife during a hurried phone call, his voice shaking with the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Every major news network is calling. CNN wants to interview me live in 20 minutes. The ACLU is sending a lawyer to make sure I'm protected. This morning I was just the IT guy trying to document something wrong happening to my colleague. Now apparently I'm at the center of a national civil rights story." His wife Sarah, a high school history teacher, understood immediately the historical significance of what her husband had captured. "David, you documented something that people have been trying to prove for decades. You showed the world exactly how racial profiling works in real time with perfect clarity. This isn't just going viral. This is becoming evidence for change." The transformation from municipal employee to accidental civil rights documentarian was overwhelming for David, who had simply followed his technological instincts and moral compass when he saw injustice unfolding. But his expertise in video technology had ensured crystal clear audio and stable footage that made denial impossible and analysis definitive. By 10 a.m., major news networks were breaking into regular programming to cover what they were uniformly calling the Riverside Incident. Anderson Cooper interrupted CNN's morning programming to announce breaking news coverage. Rachel Maddow cleared her evening show to dedicate the full hour to analysis. Even Fox News, typically skeptical of police misconduct claims, found the video evidence too overwhelming to dismiss or minimize. "Good morning, I'm Anderson Cooper, with breaking news from Riverside, California," Cooper announced as CNN cut to live coverage. "We're following a story that has sparked immediate national outrage and renewed calls for comprehensive police reform. This morning, 2 police officers attempted to arrest a city's chief of staff for what appears to be nothing more than standing while black outside his own workplace. The entire confrontation was live-streamed, providing unprecedented documentation of racial profiling in action." The segment included extended footage from David's live stream, expert analysis from former prosecutors and civil rights attorneys, and live reactions from community leaders who were calling the incident a watershed moment for police accountability. Cooper's measured delivery and obvious concern gave weight to what might have been dismissed as simply another local police controversy. Dr. Sarah Williams, professor of criminology at Georgetown University and author of 3 landmark studies on racial bias in law enforcement, had been fielding calls from news producers since 8 a.m. Her scholarly credentials, a PhD from Harvard, 20 years of research on police behavior, consultation work with departments in 43 states, and testimony before Congress on police reform, made her the most sought-after expert for analysis of the Riverside Incident. "What we witnessed in Riverside represents textbook institutional racism captured with documentary precision," Dr. Williams explained during a live appearance on Morning Joe, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying exactly this phenomenon. 2 officers saw a black man in a professional setting and immediately assumed criminality. Even when presented with official identification from the city government, they refused to consider that their initial racial assumptions might be wrong. Dr. Williams had built her academic career studying the psychological processes that allowed trained law enforcement professionals to ignore contradictory evidence when it challenged their deeply held racial assumptions. The Riverside Incident provided perfect real-world documentation of theories she had been developing through laboratory research and statistical analysis of arrest patterns. "The most remarkable and telling aspect of this incident," Dr. Williams continued, her analysis being recorded and transcribed by dozens of news organizations, "is how Chief of Staff Slater maintained his professional dignity throughout the confrontation. He demonstrated exactly the kind of composed, respectful behavior that police departments claim to value in citizen interactions. Yet the officers still treated him as a criminal threat because they simply could not see past his skin color to recognize his obvious legitimacy. Her analysis was being quoted and reshared across social media platforms, providing academic credibility and scholarly framework to what many observers were calling the most thoroughly documented case of workplace racial profiling in recent American history. Graduate students at universities across the country were already incorporating the incident into thesis research about police psychology, institutional racism, and the persistence of racial bias in professional settings. In Atlanta, civil rights attorney Benjamin Crawford was conducting back-to-back interviews with national media outlets while simultaneously reviewing David Park's footage, frame by frame, with his legal team. Crawford, who had successfully litigated dozens of police misconduct cases, including 3 that had reached the Supreme Court, immediately recognized that the Riverside incident represented something unprecedented in terms of documentation quality, institutional dynamics, and potential legal precedent. "I've been practicing civil rights law for 25 years, Crawford told Washington Post reporter Michael Harrison during a phone interview conducted while he reviewed the live stream footage on his computer screen. "I have prosecuted cases involving professors being arrested at universities, doctors being detained at hospitals, and executives being profiled at corporate headquarters. But I have never seen such clear, unambiguous evidence of racial profiling involving someone in such a significant position of governmental authority." Crawford was already drafting a comprehensive legal memo that would be circulated among civil rights attorneys nationwide, analyzing the federal law precedents that the Riverside case could establish for future litigation. The documentation was so clear, the constitutional violation so obvious, and the institutional failure so complete that it would likely become a benchmark case for civil rights law. This case will become a landmark in civil rights litigation because it demonstrates how deeply embedded racial bias is in law enforcement culture, Crawford explained to his legal team during an emergency conference call that included attorneys from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of legitimacy, professional attire, official identification, government credentials, scheduled appointments, the officers couldn't overcome their automatic assumptions about black criminality. The attorney's preliminary legal analysis was being cited by legal scholars, civil rights organizations, and policy advocates as evidence for the urgent need for comprehensive police reform at the federal level. The Riverside incident was rapidly becoming Exhibit A in congressional arguments for systemic change rather than the incremental adjustments that had characterized previous reform efforts. In communities across the country, the incident was resonating powerfully with black professionals who had experienced similar encounters with law enforcement, security personnel, and institutional authority figures throughout their careers. Social media platforms filled with personal testimonies from doctors, lawyers, professors, business executives, and government officials who shared their own experiences of being criminalized while conducting legitimate professional activities. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a prominent cardiologist from Chicago and department head at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, posted a detailed Twitter thread that was shared over 150,000 times within the first 6 hours. "Last year, I was stopped and questioned by hospital security while entering the cardiac unit where I've worked for 15 years. They assumed I was lost, didn't belong, or was visiting a patient, despite my scrubs, ID badge, and the stethoscope around my neck." The Riverside incident shows this isn't about individual bad actors or isolated misunderstandings. It's about systematic assumptions that black excellence must be constantly explained, justified, and proven. Dr. Johnson's thread continued with 17 additional tweets describing encounters at medical conferences where his expertise was questioned, hospital board meetings where his authority was challenged, and professional events where his presence was treated as inherently suspicious or requiring special explanation. Each tweet generated hundreds of replies from other medical professionals sharing virtually identical experiences. At the American Heart Association conference last year, Dr. Johnson continued in his thread. "Security asked me 3 times if I was supposed to be in the physicians' networking reception. Despite my conference badge clearly identifying me as a keynote speaker, my white colleagues walked past the same security without any questions. This is the daily reality of being a black professional in America." The cardiologist's story became emblematic of a broader phenomenon that the Riverside incident had brought into sharp national focus. The exhausting daily burden carried by Black professionals who must constantly prove their right to exist in spaces where their white counterparts are automatically assumed to belong. Dr. Jennifer Washington, professor of constitutional law at Howard University and former federal prosecutor who had argued civil rights cases before the Supreme Court, worked through the night to publish a comprehensive op-ed in the New York Times titled "The Burden of Proving Belonging: What Riverside Reveals About Professional While Black." Her piece provided scholarly context and legal framework for understanding the incident within broader patterns of institutional racial bias. Caleb Slater's experience this morning represents the daily reality for millions of Black professionals across every industry who must constantly prove their legitimacy in spaces where their white counterparts are assumed to belong without question, Dr. Washington wrote in her extensively researched piece. The officer's immediate refusal to examine his official city credentials reveals a mindset that views Black authority as inherently suspicious, Black professional success as inherently questionable, and Black presence in positions of power as requiring special justification. The op-ed was shared over 300,000 times within 12 hours and generated hundreds of response pieces from academics, professionals, journalists, and community leaders who used the Riverside incident as a launching point for broader discussions about systemic racism in American institutions, workplaces, and professional environments. At Riverside City Hall, the administrative response was swift, comprehensive, and politically sophisticated. Mayor Patricia Williams, recognizing that the incident represented both crisis and opportunity, convened an emergency session of the City Council to address the situation and outline immediate reform measures that would position Riverside as a national leader in police accountability. The meeting, normally attended by a handful of community members and local activists, was packed beyond capacity as over 500 residents, civil rights advocates, journalists, and college students conducting research on police accountability attempted to attend a session in chambers designed for 150 people. Security had to establish multiple overflow areas in adjacent conference rooms with live stream connections, while hundreds more gathered outside City Hall with signs demanding justice and reform. The incident that occurred this morning on the steps of our City Hall represents a complete failure of the principles we claim to uphold as a community, Mayor Williams told the packed council chambers, her voice carrying over the standing room-only crowd that included longtime residents, civil rights activists from surrounding cities, and journalists from national news organizations. We will not treat this as an isolated incident requiring only individual discipline. We will treat this as clear evidence of systemic problems requiring systematic, comprehensive solutions. Mayor Williams had spent the hours since the incident consulting with civil rights attorneys, police reform experts, and community leaders to develop a response that would address both immediate accountability and long-term institutional change. Her political background as a former prosecutor gave her credibility on law enforcement issues, while her campaign promises about police reform created expectations for meaningful action. Effective immediately, Patricia announced to sustained applause, "We are implementing emergency measures that will transform how law enforcement operates in our community. These include mandatory implicit bias training for all city employees, comprehensive review of police department procedures by external experts, establishment of a civilian oversight board with real authority and subpoena power, invitation for federal monitoring of all law enforcement activities, and creation of a community advisory panel with binding authority over police policy and budget allocations." The announcement generated sustained applause from the packed chambers and immediate coverage from national news organizations that were framing Riverside as a potential model for municipal response to documented police misconduct. Caleb Slater, who had begun the morning planning to attend a routine budget meeting, found himself at the center of a national conversation about racial justice, institutional accountability, and the possibility of meaningful police reform. His strategic decision to frame the incident as evidence of systemic problems rather than seeking individual punishment was being praised by civil rights leaders as politically sophisticated and morally principled. Mr. Slater's response demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership our movement needs at this critical moment, said Dr. Angela Davis, the renowned civil rights activist, scholar, and author, In a detailed statement released through her foundation, rather than seeking personal vindication or individual justice, he has positioned this incident as an opportunity for the kind of comprehensive institutional transformation that communities across the country desperately need and have been demanding for generations. The endorsement from Dr. Davis, whose activism spanning 6 decades had made her one of the most respected voices in civil rights advocacy, carried enormous weight within activist circles and helped frame Caleb's approach as strategically sound rather than insufficiently aggressive in pursuing individual accountability. As evening news programs across the country prepared their coverage of the Riverside incident, producers and journalists were recognizing that they were dealing with a story that transcended typical police misconduct coverage and had the potential to influence national policy discussions about police reform, racial justice, and institutional accountability for years to come. The incident that had begun with a simple case of mistaken assumptions outside City Hall was becoming a catalyst for the kind of national conversation about race, authority, and justice that had the potential to generate lasting, meaningful change in communities across America. 6 months after the incident that would forever be known as the Riverside Awakening, Caleb Slater stood before a packed auditorium at the International Association of Chiefs of Police annual conference, delivering a keynote address that had been requested by law enforcement leaders from across the globe. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in attendance. The man who had been racially profiled by officers was now teaching those same officers how to prevent similar incidents from destroying their careers and communities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caleb began, his voice carrying the same professional composure that had sustained him through that morning confrontation. "6 months ago, I experienced firsthand what millions of Black Americans face daily. The assumption that our presence in professional spaces requires explanation, justification, or approval from those who cannot imagine us belonging there." The audience of 2,000 police chiefs, federal law enforcement officials, and criminal justice researchers listened in complete silence. Many had studied the Riverside incident extensively, had implemented policy changes based on its lessons, and had used the footage in training programs designed to prevent similar catastrophes in their own departments. "The officers who confronted me that morning weren't inherently evil," Caleb continued, his words being simultaneously translated into 12 languages for the international audience. "They were products of a system that had failed to challenge their assumptions, failed to provide adequate training on implicit bias, and failed to create accountability measures that could prevent racial profiling from destroying lives and careers." Chief Patricia Morrison of the Seattle Police Department, who had flown to Riverside 3 times to study their reform implementation, scribbled notes furiously as Caleb spoke. Her department had experienced its own viral incident 2 years earlier, but nothing as thoroughly documented or politically consequential as what had happened at Riverside City Hall. "The question isn't whether racial bias exists in law enforcement," Patricia whispered to her assistant, Deputy Chief Michael Chen. "The question is whether departments have the courage to confront it systematically, rather than simply hoping individual incidents don't go viral." Caleb's presentation included a detailed timeline of the reforms that had been implemented in Riverside following the incident. The transformation had been comprehensive, touching every aspect of police operations, from recruitment and training to community engagement and disciplinary procedures. Within 30 days of the incident, Caleb explained, advancing to a slide showing before and after statistics, Riverside implemented mandatory implicit bias training for all sworn officers, civilian oversight with subpoena power, body cameras for every police interaction, and community advisory boards with real authority over policy and budget decisions. The reforms had been controversial within police circles, with some union leaders arguing that external oversight would undermine officer safety and operational effectiveness. But the alternative, federal intervention and court-ordered changes, had convinced most stakeholders that proactive reform was preferable to imposed accountability. Dr. Sarah Williams, the Georgetown criminology professor who had become a national expert on the Riverside case, presented data showing the measurable impact of the reforms. Use of force incidents decreased by 47% in the first 6 months. Community complaints dropped by 62%. Officer morale, contrary to union predictions, actually improved as ambiguous situations were clarified through better training and clearer policies. The statistical improvements were impressive, but the cultural transformation was even more significant. Officers who had initially resisted the changes were discovering that explicit bias training and clear procedural guidelines actually made their jobs easier by removing the guesswork from community interactions. Officer Maria Gonzalez, no relation to the budget analyst, a 5-year veteran of the Riverside Police Department, had been among the most skeptical of the reforms when they were first announced. "I thought we were being punished for what Morgan and Torres did," she explained during a panel discussion at the conference. "But the training helped me recognize my own assumptions about who belongs where. Last month I met a black teenager in an expensive car, and my first instinct was suspicion, but the training kicked in. I introduced myself professionally, explained why I had approached him, and discovered he was the mayor's nephew driving his grandmother to a doctor's appointment." The transformation of Officer Gonzalez from skeptic to advocate illustrated the broader cultural shift that had occurred within the Riverside Police Department. The reforms weren't simply punitive measures imposed after misconduct. They were professional development tools that helped officers navigate complex social dynamics more effectively. Chief Daniel Morrison, who had survived the crisis and overseen the department's transformation, credited the comprehensive nature of the reforms for their success. "We didn't just address individual behavior," he explained to the conference audience. "We examined every policy, every training protocol, every promotional criterion to identify where racial bias might influence decision-making." The federal investigation that had been triggered by the incident had concluded with a consent decree that required ongoing monitoring of Riverside police practices for 5 years. But rather than viewing federal oversight as punishment, the department had embraced it as validation of their reform efforts. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, who had overseen the federal investigation, appeared via video link to address the conference. "The Riverside case demonstrates that meaningful police reform is possible when communities demand accountability and departments respond with genuine commitment to change rather than defensive denial." The Department of Justice had used Riverside as a model for reform implementations in 12 other cities that had experienced similar viral incidents of police misconduct. The comprehensive approach, addressing policy, training, oversight, and culture simultaneously, had proven more effective than piecemeal reforms that focused only on individual accountability. In the audience, Joshua Morgan sat in the back row, barely recognizable from the aggressive officer who had attempted to arrest Caleb 6 months earlier. His termination from the Riverside Police Department had been swift and permanent, but his personal journey toward understanding had been longer and more complex. "I spent 12 years thinking I was a good cop," Joshua said during a private interview after the conference session. "The Riverside incident forced me to confront the reality that good intentions aren't enough if they're built on biased assumptions. I destroyed my career because I couldn't see past my prejudices." Joshua had spent the months since his termination in counseling, attending bias training workshops, and working with community organizations to understand the impact of his actions. He would never work in law enforcement again, but he had become an unlikely advocate for the kind of training that might prevent other officers from making his mistakes. "The hardest part wasn't losing my job," he continued, his voice heavy with regret. "The hardest part was realizing that everything I thought I knew about protecting and serving was contaminated by racism I didn't even recognize. Mr. Slater had every right to file criminal charges against me, but instead he used the incident to create change that will prevent other officers from destroying their careers the way I destroyed mine." Rebecca Torres had undergone a similar transformation, though her path toward accountability had included successful completion of an intensive bias training program that allowed her to transition to a civilian position within the police department's community relations division. Her lived experience of how quickly bias could destroy careers made her an effective trainer for new recruits. "I tell every new officer the same thing," Rebecca explained during her portion of the conference presentation. "Your assumptions about who belongs where, who looks suspicious, and who deserves respect will determine whether you have a long career serving your community or a viral video that ends everything you've worked to achieve." The training program that Rebecca helped develop had been adopted by police academies in 15 states, using the Riverside incident as a case study in how unconscious bias could overwhelm professional judgment and destroy both individual careers and community trust. David Park, whose live stream had documented the original incident, had been invited to speak about the role of technology in police accountability. The IT director had become an unlikely expert on transparency and documentation, consulting with civil rights organizations about effective strategies for recording police encounters. The technology exists to document every police interaction, David explained to the conference audience. The question is whether departments will embrace transparency as a tool for accountability or continue to view documentation as a threat to officer autonomy. Riverside had implemented comprehensive body camera policies that required activation for every citizen contact, with disciplinary consequences for officers who failed to record interactions. The policy had generated initial resistance but had ultimately protected officers from false complaints while providing evidence for accountability when misconduct occurred. Dr. Angela Davis, now 79 but still commanding audiences with her powerful advocacy, had traveled to Riverside to observe the 6-month anniversary of the incident. Her assessment of the transformation was characteristically direct and insightful. The Riverside model demonstrates that viral incidents of police misconduct can become catalysts for genuine reform. If communities and institutions have the courage to address systemic problems rather than simply punishing individual actors, Dr. Davis said during a community forum attended by over 800 residents. The civil rights icon's endorsement of Riverside's approach had influenced reform efforts in dozens of other cities where activists used the Riverside Standard as a benchmark for comprehensive police accountability measures. Mayor Patricia Williams, whose political future had initially seemed threatened by the incident, had seen her national profile elevated by the successful implementation of police reforms. She was now being recruited by national Democratic leaders as a potential candidate for higher office, with the Riverside transformation serving as evidence of her executive competence and commitment to racial justice. The morning when I found my chief of staff being arrested by our own police officers could have been the end of my political career, Patricia reflected during a private interview in her office, the same office where she and Caleb had planned to discuss police budgets on that transformative morning. Instead, it became the beginning of the most meaningful work I've ever done as a public servant. The mayor's approval ratings had actually increased following the incident, as community members appreciated her immediate accountability measures and comprehensive reform implementation. The political calculation that swift, decisive action would be rewarded by voters had proven correct. Caleb Slater himself had undergone his own transformation, evolving from a behind-the-scenes administrator to a national voice for institutional accountability and racial justice. Speaking requests poured in from universities, conferences, and community organizations seeking his perspective on transforming individual incidents into systemic change. 6 months ago, I was humiliated, angry, and exhausted by having to prove my humanity to officers who couldn't see past my skin color, Caleb said, as he concluded his keynote address to the police chiefs. Today I stand before you not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a public servant who has seen that meaningful change is possible when institutions choose accountability over defensiveness. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, with law enforcement officials from 6 continents rising to acknowledge both his personal grace and the professional wisdom he had demonstrated throughout the crisis and its aftermath. In the months following the conference, the Riverside protocols were implemented in over 200 police departments across the United States and internationally. The comprehensive approach to bias training, community oversight, and transparency had become the gold standard for police reform efforts worldwide. The incident that had begun with 2 officers making racist assumptions about a black man in a suit had evolved into a global movement for police accountability and racial justice. The silent dignity that Caleb had maintained during those crucial minutes on the City Hall steps had ultimately spoken louder than any protest, any lawsuit, or any political speech. As Caleb packed his materials after the conference, he reflected on the journey from that humiliating morning to this moment of international recognition. The transformation hadn't erased the pain of being criminalized in his own workplace, but it had given that pain purpose and meaning. His phone buzzed with a text from Mayor Williams. Watched your keynote online. Proud to serve alongside someone who turned personal injustice into institutional justice. The morning that could have destroyed us became the morning that defined us. Caleb smiled as he read the message, remembering the fear and uncertainty they had both felt as they walked into City Hall 6 months earlier, knowing that their response to the crisis would determine whether it became a moment of shame or a catalyst for change. They had chosen change, and that choice had created a new standard for accountability, dignity, and justice that would influence communities around the world for generations to come. The silent resistance had become a revolution, and the revolution had become a new way of thinking about what was possible when individuals refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Thank you for following this story to its transformative conclusion. If you believe that documented injustice can become documented change, if you think that individual dignity can inspire institutional accountability, then please don't let this story scroll past like just another video in an endless feed. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed bias in professional settings? Have you seen individuals turn personal challenges into community progress? Your voice matters in conversations about justice and change. Each share, each comment, each like helps ensure that stories of accountability and transformation reach people who need to see that change is possible, that dignity under pressure can create lasting progress. We create these stories not just for entertainment, but because we believe that understanding how injustice works and how it can be transformed helps communities build better systems and stronger institutions. If you found value in this story of silent resistance becoming systemic change, please like, share, and subscribe to Color of Justice. Help us continue telling stories that matter, stories that document both the persistence of bias and the possibility of transformation. You're helping ensure that the voices of those who choose dignity over anger, accountability over revenge, and justice over retribution continue to be heard and celebrated.